many of you, I have been fascinated this past week watching the interviews of the astronauts on the Artemis II mission. How many of you have been following along? They landed over a week ago, but a lot of the interviews have been this week while they've been adjusting to being Earthside. It's just incredible that this is the first moonshot in more than 5 decades, going further than any human has gone before to the dark side of the moon. The photos are just phenomenal that have been shared. But what was really intriguing to me as I watched some of these interviews with them and the stories that they shared was the way that they described their re-entry into Earth. I don't know if any of you heard it. I am not a science person at all, so I cannot describe to you how it all happens and when they were using all of these space terms. I didn't know what they meant at all. I cannot explain the technicalities of cutting through the Earth's atmosphere, but they described this intense 13 minutes and 36 seconds as being 10 times wilder than any rocket launch. Coming back was a lot wilder, and they experienced 5,000-degree fireball that was so blinding that the 2 astronauts who kind of had a panoramic view of it said, "Is it supposed to be this big?" Right? And then they were going 25,000 miles an hour. They couldn't speak normally because of the pressure on their chest. And there was this moment before hitting the water that was a lot of rumbling happening that they probably weren't expecting so much. And Christine Cook talked about how Reed Wiseman said during that time, "This is nominal. Everything is nominal." And Cook says that she remembers thinking, he has no idea if this is nominal, but I'm really glad that he said that right now, right in that time. Wiseman also said that hitting the water was a spiritual moment because they knew that they had made it alive and safe. Now, the whole crew said that for the most part, their entire experience was smooth with very few glitches or alarms. They all worked well together on this mission, but it was always in the back of their mind, right? That one small misstep could go wrong and, just wipe away the entire mission or them. And so that final descent after everything that they had been through must have been pretty terrifying for them. And Wiseman's levity in that moment was probably just what they needed. I wonder what comforts you during times of fear. What is it that gives you peace? We are in the second of a 2-part series of living into the resurrection. We are now in this series called Eastertide that is 50 days long. And it's a reminder to us in this season of the church that the resurrection isn't just a one-time event. We say he is risen because Jesus is still risen. God is still in the business of making new things and bringing new life. And so the resurrection is something that we live into with Jesus, working with God to bring new life. And what you just heard from Brian picks up from where we left off last week, but it's still the day of Jesus' resurrection. If you weren't with us last week, or if you're not familiar with the story, that's fine. Last week, we talked about Mary Magdalene being at the empty tomb on Easter morning, seeing Jesus, right, in his resurrected form, and then she follows Jesus' instructions to go and tell the others. She becomes the very first preacher of the gospel as she goes to the disciples and says, "I have seen the Lord." So now it's the evening time, and the disciples are in this locked house, and really their fear is probably, it says they have fear of the Jews, but what John means is that many of the religious authorities who played a role in Jesus' crucifixion, now they're afraid of how they're going to react if this news that Mary told them was really true, yet they had a lot of trouble believing it. The disciples aren't very trusting of Mary's witness, and it isn't the first or the last time that a man will not believe a woman. All of the women here know that to be true. But from their perspective, it was really scary, right? in their position, we would probably be feeling the same. They were probably thinking, what is going to happen if what Mary is saying really is true? What's going to happen to us? And what's going to happen to Jesus? This is really hard for them to wrap their minds around. And then Jesus just walks through their wall. Really, we don't know if he walks through a wall, but he appears in this house that is very locked up, right? There's no back door. He just appears there. And that's really where all of this starts to go into motion. He says, "Peace be with you." And without questioning, he shows them his hands, he shows them his side. They could see from his scars of his crucifixion that it was really him. And I want for us to stay just a few moments with that phrase, "Peace be with you." He says it twice when he appears to the disciples. Jesus breathes on them and tells them to receive the Holy Spirit and then to go out and forgive others. Now, we all have a greeting time that y'all are pretty familiar with in the beginning of our service. When it's Communion Sundays, we usually have it right before communion. Throughout our last series, we had it after a prayer of confession that we would do with one another during the Lenten season. But that time has really, from a tradition known as passing of the peace. Some of you might be familiar with it if you grew up in church. And in that time, we acknowledge that we all have a need for forgiveness and grace. And so when we greet one another in church, we join in that forgiveness that Christ gives and that we are called to give one another. So it's not just about saying, "How are you? Nice to see you today." It's really about offering peace to one another. And there's not a lot of peace in our world today. There's a whole lot of fear and a whole lot of hiding behind locked doors, much like the disciples. I was reminded recently of the movie Gifted. It's a movie that came out in 2017. You might remember it. It starred Chris Evans and McKenna Grace, and it was about a girl named Mary, played by McKenna, who is extremely gifted. She's being raised by her uncle Frank, who's played by Chris Evans. And Frank is the only family that Mary knows. Her mother was very young when she became pregnant with her, and then her mother took her own life in Frank's home when Mary was a baby, so it left Mary in Frank's house when she did so. And so Frank and his sister both had a really not good relationship with their mother, and so for fear that his mother would interfere in Mary's life, in a harmful way, Frank moved with Mary from New England, where they lived, down to Florida to raise Mary away from her. And the first scene in this movie shows Mary getting ready for her very first day of school. She doesn't want to go. Her uncle is very hesitant to take her to school. She's actually in first grade. I think he homeschooled her before then. And he has a real fear that the school will find out who she is and somehow it will get back to his mother, who's going to come and try to take her away from him. And so Frank is living in fear. He needs to give his niece an education, but he also doesn't want to put her in harm's way. And I think Frank represents, maybe on a different scale, depending on people's situations, how so many of us live in fear. How so many have fear controlling their lives. I wonder if there are things that drive you or others to live in fear. I think some people have a fear of one another. We fear those who have wronged us or those who have been wronged. We fear confrontation because we don't know how another will act if we try to find reconciliation, right? There's a lot of fear in that. I can't tell you the number of times that I've resisted reaching out to someone who has wronged me or who I have wronged because it's much easier to just hide all that, right? To hold on to the grudge or to let another's mistake cloud our image of them forever or people who are like them. If we've wronged someone else, it's just easier, right? To break ties, to move away from the situation, to walk away. And all of it might seem easier, but when we do that, we're prisoners to our fear because we're unwilling to seek forgiveness. Some of us also fear our own security or our own safety in a world that is filled with crime, and that fear can absolutely run our lives. There's a fear of having rights taken away, and that's so very real for many in our country and our world. So many also live in fear of the future, unsure of what will happen, unsure of decisions that will be made that will affect large groups of people. There's a fear of being taken away or from losing everything that is very real for so many right now. And it's not just in our country, it's around the world, right? Especially in the Middle East right now, there is so much fear, and the root of war is often fear. It's hard to find the resurrection in the midst of war and destruction. But Jesus appears in the middle of that. He appears in the middle of a locked room that is filled with fear. And when the good news of the resurrection is impossibly hard to find, Jesus shows up in the middle of hiding, in the middle of terror, and what's more, Jesus shows up to show his scars that can still be seen, to show that he was just murdered 2 days earlier by the very people whom the disciples are hiding from. He appears, and even in their terror and their fear, Jesus speaks love directly to them in 4 words: peace be with you. Reverend Dawn Chesser writes about Jesus' words to the disciples, and she kind of writes what he says a little differently. She says, "Peace be with you. I am sending you as God has sent me to go forth and minister into the midst of the fearful, the hiders, the closeted, the condemned, the ostracized, the haters, and the hated. I am sending you as God has sent me to breathe peace into these places of darkness." Now, we can't forget that Thomas wasn't there, right? For those of you who know this story, you know that the phrase doubting Thomas, because he didn't believe that Jesus was alive after the disciples told him this story. And we want to call him doubting Thomas, but I also just got to say, we need to remember that none of the disciples believed Mary until they saw Jesus with their own eyes too. So all of them are guilty here, right? Now, the word believe is used quite a bit in that story, and I want to talk about that word. Thomas says he won't believe until he can touch Jesus. Jesus tells him not to doubt, but to believe, and so on. So the original language of John is written in Greek. All the Gospels are written in Greek. And the Greek root behind the English word believe is pist, P-I-S-T. And it's often translated, if it's a noun, it's translated as the word faith, and if it's a verb, it's most often translated as the word believe. It's very contextual, depending on the translators too, as well. But it can also be used as a concept of trusting in someone or something. That word pist can also mean trusting in someone. So this can widen our understanding of it a bit, because if we believe something, we usually believe with our brain, right? We either agree or disagree, but trust is a much more relational, and it includes the feeling that can influence our thoughts and our actions. We talk about believing with our heads and trusting with our hearts, right? And so I wonder what it would look like to see Jesus' words in this way. Jesus says to Thomas, "Do not be distrusting, but trusting. And are you trusting because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to trust." And then at the end, when John says, "This was written so that you may come to trust that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through trusting you may have life in his name." How might we believe in the resurrection in a way that opens up our heart to trust? How many of you have ever used Airbnb? Lots of you, some 2 hands. We love traveling through Airbnb and getting to explore different places. If you're not familiar with it, it's been around for over a decade now, but people will open up their homes, sometimes an apartment that's adjacent to their house or a whole other house that they have that's not being used while they're away, and people can go and rent their actual space through Airbnb. Joe Gebbia is the founder, and in a TED Talk about a decade ago when he was first starting, when Airbnb was really taking off, he talked about how designing for trust was a big factor in getting people to open up their doors to let others in and getting people to enter the homes of others too. Designing for trust was a big part of Airbnb's mission. I think Jesus is really trying to prepare the disciples here to design for trust, right? To get them out of the door, even when it was very scary and very risky to move outside of their house for whatever laid outside, but to do it to fulfill the commission of Jesus. And I think our churches also have the opportunity to be designed for trust too. Designing for trust allows us to open up our own doors, to welcome others in, even when that might be scary, because we never know who's going to walk in our doors, right? But it also gives us the courage to go out into the community, which also can sometimes be scary with people that are a lot different from us, but that's where God calls us to go to, right? It means replacing our fear with trust. In so many of our lives, replacing fear with trust means having trust that God has got us, and trust that God isn't going to let us go when we enter into the unknown, when we go out to bring peace to others living in fear. What's more, God's going to be right there with us. The Holy Spirit that the disciples receive is still alive and well among us, and it gives us also the authority to speak a word of peace into the midst of fear. That means seeking and offering forgiveness. It means standing up for those who are on the margin. Also, in this climate, it might mean being silent so that we don't add to the noise, right? Or listening for God's guidance and how we offer peace in this time. It might mean finding practices that can bring peace to your heart, maybe surrounding yourselves with groups of people, some of them right around you, that can encourage peace. And you might also feel super encouraged to find peace through serving, and there are a number of opportunities to do that here in this place. I think I'm going to be fascinated by Artemis II for a really long time. One more thing that I loved was the ways that they talked about working together. It is amazing to me that these 4 astronauts, of course they became best friends, they said, by the end, but they were together in this small spaceship for 10 days without gravity either. So they had to be close to each other because they're just floating around in that spaceship, right? And every time, though, I don't know if you noticed, every time they were filmed, when there was the live feed happening or conversations happening back to the spaceship, they always looked so happy, right? They looked so happy to be together. I don't know if I could do that after being with 3 other individuals for 10 days in a short space with one another, right? There are no secrets in that space. Everyone is so close together. And they said that part of that was that they were just buzzing with productivity and getting their mission done after planning it for so long, right? It was finally happening, so they were so excited. But everything they did, they said, was a 4-person activity. I don't know about going to the bathroom, but exercising, right, was even a 4-person activity. Eating together was a 4-person activity. And while so many, myself included, would find tension in that, they said that they used it as a way to get through instead of seeing it as an obstacle. They just embraced it, right? Which is really beautiful. They got exceptionally good at communicating with one another and crawling around each other in that space for 10 days. But they were also encouraged by the way that the world came together to watch them and to be a part of it. And in describing that encouragement, they said that it means that as humans together, we still have it. We can still do amazing things for this world when we learn how to work together. Some of you today might be feeling like you are hiding behind a locked door in a locked room. Perhaps not literally, but in your own heart, you might feel locked in. And if you are, I hope that you will find Jesus walking through walls for you to break down all those walls that get put up in your life and meeting you right where you are. And when we are met by Jesus, we find that he wipes away our fear and he offers us peace to breathe God's love into the world. I invite you to pray with me.